The bizarre story took place in Yishui County, where a man named Liu lived with his wife, Han Han. The couple was harmonious and loving. Every day, the two worked hard in the fields. Liu was diligent, and in return, Han Han took great care of him. Liu had lost his father at an early age, leaving him as the only male in the family. The couple longed to have a child to carry on the family lineage. However, things never go as planned. Despite Liu's nightly efforts, they still had no children. As time passed, one day, Liu suddenly suffered a stroke and died. Overcome with grief, Han Han cried until she had no more tears left. After the funeral, her mother-in-law advised her to remarry while she was still young. She only wanted Han Han to have a better life. But Han Han was determined to remain faithful and refused to remarry. She declared that she had married into the Liu family in life and would remain part of the Liu family in death. Because of this, her mother-in-law repeatedly tried to persuade her. One day, her mother-in-law once again urged her to remarry, fearing that she would be alone and criticized by others in the future. However, as she opened the bedroom door, she was taken aback. Inside the room stood a clay statue that looked exactly like Liu. Han Han had commissioned it to keep her husband by her side, as if he was still alive. She treated the statue as if it were a real person, talking to it daily and even setting a bowl and chopsticks for it during meals. Day after day, Han Han truly felt as if her husband was still with her. One night, just as she was about to go to bed, she suddenly felt someone grab her hand. To her shock, it was the clay statue. The statue rose and spoke, saying that the king of hell had been moved by her unwavering devotion and had granted him a few days to return to the mortal world. Hearing his voice and words, Han Han was certain that this was indeed her husband. That night, the two reunited as husband and wife. Liu explained that the Liu family was destined to be without descendants, but because of Han Han's deep love, the king of hell had allowed him to return just once to leave behind an heir. After a night of passion, at dawn, her husband turned back into a clay statue. From then on, Han Han never left the house, spending all her time with the clay statue of her husband. A month later, Han Han started feeling strange and soon realized she was pregnant. She told her mother-in-law everything. At first, the old woman didn't believe it, but then she reasoned. Han Han had never stepped foot outside, so how could she have been with another man? Looking at the clay statue that bore the likeness of her son, she felt an inexplicable aura of life emanating from it. For a moment, she truly believed that it was her son. That night, Liu bid Han Han farewell, telling her that his time was up and he had to leave. He urged her to take good care of their child. The couple tearfully parted ways, not knowing when they would ever meet again. After that night, the clay statue never moved again. Nevertheless, Han Han continued to care for it as if it was still her husband, keeping it by her side. 10 months later, she gave birth to a healthy, chubby baby boy. Her mother-in-law held the child in her arms and examined him closely. The eyes, the nose, the face, they were exactly the same as her son's when he was born. Convinced, she fully believed that this was her own grandson. However, the neighbors all believed that Han Han had been unfaithful and had a child with another man. They gossiped and spread rumors about her. Some even took the matter to the authorities, accusing Han Han of adultery and violating the virtues of a wife. Han Han knelt before the magistrate and recounted how her husband had returned in the form of a clay statue to leave behind his bloodline. The magistrate's advisor suggested using an old folk method to test whether the child was human or something else, by placing the child under sunlight. If the child was not human, his shadow would either be missing or appear faint. Immediately, the magistrate ordered his men to lift the child high, casting his shadow upon the wall. Sure enough, the child's shadow was faint and unclear, unlike that of an ordinary person. Touched by Han Han's unwavering love and devotion, the magistrate instructed her to take good care of the child and allowed her to return home. Time passed, and the boy grew up strong and healthy, just like any other child. As he grew older, his features increasingly resembled Liu, and eventually, people stopped gossiping about Han Han. From then on, Han Han continued to keep the clay statue of her husband in the room. However, the statue never moved again. A strange tale befell a young scholar named Jaki, who lived in a temple and devoted himself to his studies every day. One day, while Jaki was reading in his room, a sorrowful singing voice suddenly echoed from outside the window. The singer was a young woman, her voice mournful and full of sorrow, yet also eerily beautiful, stirring Jaki's curiosity. Hearing the song, his heart wavered, and his mind was drawn into its melancholic melody. Jaki stepped outside, eager to see who was singing. Following the voice, he saw a young woman dressed in green silk sitting on a rock. The young woman looked startled upon seeing Jaki, quickly standing up to leave. But Jaki hastily spoke to reassure her. She paid him no mind and walked away quickly, but Jaki followed, explaining that he meant no harm. Jaki expressed that he was captivated by her singing and wished to get to know her. However, the young woman appeared deeply troubled, glancing around fearfully. She said that the one she feared was not Jaki, but a monstrous creature lurking nearby. Jaki reassured her, saying that the safest place would be his room. He boasted that, although he was a scholar, he had studied magic and could protect her. Then, he led her back to his quarters. But soon, desire overcame him. He could not resist embracing the young woman and pulling her onto his bed. Jaki whispered that if she could overcome his inner demon, then she need not fear any other monster outside. After subduing Jaki's demon, the young woman finally revealed the true creature she feared, a man-eating monster. The woman in green told him that her kind had suffered at the hands of this beast for many years, causing countless deaths. If Jaki could slay it, she would be forever grateful. At dawn, the woman left. Jaki also stepped out of his room and walked to the temple courtyard, looking up. Hanging on the wall was an ancient sword. To defeat the creature, he knew he had to wield this demon-slaying blade. Jaki took it down. It had been a long time since he last used it. Though made of wood, the sword possessed the power to vanquish demons. He recalled the woman's warning that the creature would appear at midnight, so he patiently waited. At the stroke of midnight, a desperate cry for help rang out from beyond the window. The voice sounded familiar. It seemed to be hers. Without hesitation, Jaki drew his sword and rushed outside. In the darkness, he saw a monstrous creature with 8 arms, carrying several cocoon-like bundles on its back, each containing a person inside. Without a second thought, Jaki brandished his sword and challenged the beast. The demon was no ordinary creature. Sensing a threat, it dropped the women and lunged straight at Jaki. Jaki's combat skills were undeniable, He swung his sword and severed one of the demon's arms. With swift and agile movements, he struck relentlessly. As he dodged, he landed a deep slash across the monster's back. The creature crouched low, opening its mouth and spewing a thick white silk thread. The web wrapped tightly around Jaki's arm. This spider silk was incredibly strong, trapping his limb completely. In a desperate move, Jaki grabbed the ancient sword and launched a lightning-fast thrust. The blade flew forward with immense force, piercing straight through the monster's head. Just then, a wave of dizziness washed over him. Jaki lost balance and collapsed. He had used all his strength to defeat the beast. When he awoke, he found himself slumped over his desk. Thinking it had all been a dream, he glanced at the ancient sword, only to find it stained with green liquid, just like in his vision. Alarmed, he rushed outside to search for the woman in green. Reaching the back courtyard, he saw a giant spider web stretched across a tree. A fist-sized spider lay dead, its head crushed, with a few green insects still trapped in the web. Jaki took one of the living insects back to his room. Moments later, the green insect recovered, crawled onto the inkstone, and dipped itself in ink. It moved across a sheet of paper, leaving behind a single character: "Thank you." The insect then circled Jaki a few times. Then, it flew out the window. From that day on, the woman in green was never seen again. This terrifying story is about a man named Kun, who possessed a strange talent. He had an incredibly keen sense of smell. However, he couldn't detect just anything. To demonstrate his ability to his friend, Kun immediately signaled that he had picked up a strange scent. Kun told his friend that there was a snake nearby. He could smell it. Whether it was hiding in the grass or wedged between cracks in bricks and stones, he could track it down by scent alone. What terrified others didn't faze him at all. The snake he had just caught, he lifted high in triumph, as if it were a trophy. Despite the snake's aggression and attempts to strike, Kun showed no fear or hesitation. Without a second thought, he stuffed the snake into his mouth and bit off its head. It was horrifying. He chewed the snake's head as if savoring a delicacy. Those who witnessed the scene were nauseated, but Kun appeared delighted. In no time, he had swallowed the entire snake. He even called it the finest delicacy on earth and urged his friend to give it a try. His talent was innate, and his friend, amazed, asked him about the secret behind it. So Kun recounted his story. He said that when he was just a toddler, his father and some friends were drinking in the courtyard one day. He was playing nearby when his mother suddenly ran out of the house in panic, screaming about a snake. In the grass before him, a snake was slithering toward him, flicking its tongue threateningly. His parents rushed over to save him, but when they arrived, they were both frozen in shock. The snake hadn't harmed Kun. Instead, he had grabbed it and was gnawing on it. His parents were horrified by the sight. From that moment on, he became obsessed with the taste. He would frequently roam around hunting for snakes. No matter what kind of snake he encountered, they all seemed paralyzed in his presence, allowing him to devour them alive. It became a habit. To him, even the chickens and ducks in the house were nothing compared to this delicacy. His mother believed he was possessed by an evil spirit, so she went to the temple daily to pray for him. She repeatedly urged him to give up this habit. Kun would nod in agreement, but he simply couldn't stop. His mother swore that if he didn't abandon his killing of snakes, she would remain in the temple forever. One day, while Kun was playing with his wife and children in their room, a massive python suddenly burst in. In an instant, it swallowed his wife and children whole. It showed no fear of Kun whatsoever. After devouring his family, the python slithered toward the Buddhist altar, and Kun could only watch, helpless. The massive serpent then swallowed his mother as well. Kun stood frozen in agony, unable to do anything. Suddenly, he woke up. It had only been a dream, but everything had felt disturbingly real. Seeing that his wife and children were safe, he immediately rushed to the Buddhist altar, afraid that his mother might still be in danger. In the courtyard, he saw a massive python slowly making its way across the rooftop. Fortunately, his mother was unharmed. From that day forward, Kun understood. The python had come to warn him. He and his mother devoted themselves to Buddha, embraced vegetarianism, and he abandoned his habit of eating snakes forever. This terrifying story took place in the 1960s in a poor coastal village. Most of the villagers made a living from small-scale fishing, just enough to get by each day. On a sweltering summer morning, a villager named Juju woke up early, paddled his small boat to the middle of the lake, and began fishing. However, despite casting many nets all morning, he barely caught anything. By noon, the scorching sun blazed down on the lake, driving the larger fish deep into the reeds, far from his nets. Time and time again, his net brought up only small fish and debris, making Juju frustrated. He decided to row farther out. If he still had no luck, he would return home for a nap. Staring at his empty nets, Juju felt extremely anxious. If not for his son needing money to attend school in the district, he wouldn't have been out here under such brutal heat. Reluctantly, Juju paddled deeper into the lake. Normally, fishermen like him rarely ventured this far, but today he had no other choice. He cast a large net. Immediately, he felt a strong tug from beneath the water, as if he had caught something huge. He tried lifting the net and felt the heavy weight pulling down on his arms. Excitement surged through him. This time, he was sure his boat would be full. Overjoyed, Juju used all his strength to haul in the net, but as the catch gradually surfaced, his face turned pale. What was trapped in the net was not a fish, but a bizarre green-skinned creature thrashing violently. Its rough, scaly skin looked diseased. Its eerie yellow eyes glowed menacingly, and its mouth was filled with razor-sharp fangs. An absolutely terrifying sight. Its entire body was covered in a slimy mucus, and its sharp claws were tangled with seaweed, clearly marking it as an aquatic creature. Juju had never seen such a thing before, but he had heard the village elders speak of it. He guessed that it must be a water demon. According to ancient tales, seeing a water demon was an omen of disaster. Knowing he couldn't just release it back into the water, Juju decided to wrap it tightly in his net and carry it back to the village. Water demons were known to feed on fish and shrimp. Wherever they appeared, the aquatic life in the area would vanish. Juju suspected that this monster was the reason he hadn't caught any fish that morning. News of Juju capturing a water demon spread quickly throughout the small village, causing a stir. The villagers gathered to witness the legendary creature with their own eyes. By then, Juju had tied the water demon tightly to an ancient locust tree in the center of the village. Its fierce appearance sent chills through everyone. Just then, an elderly man hurried over. He confirmed that this was indeed the water demon he had heard about in his youth. Seeing Juju about to stab the creature with a knife, the old man urgently stopped him. He explained that this creature had existed for centuries. Killing it outright would bring misfortune. The only proper way to deal with it was to expose it to sunlight until its demonic energy dissipated, as passed down from their ancestors. Still angry about his poor catch, Juju refused to follow such a tedious method. He shoved the old man aside and plunged his knife into the creature. The blade stabbed into the monster's side, and thick black blood oozed out, carrying an unbearable stench. The putrid smell was so overpowering that the surrounding villagers had to back away. Juju himself felt dizzy from the stench and could not bring himself to strike again. The old man warned him that by ignoring the advice, he would certainly suffer misfortune. Suddenly, someone screamed. The water demon had abruptly stopped moving. The elder recalled the ancient stories. Water demons were extremely aggressive, but their bodies were weak against sunlight. The knife wound had killed it instantly. He advised Juju to buy a coffin and give the creature a proper burial, or else bad luck would follow. But Juju refused to waste money on a stone coffin for a monster. Instead, he dragged its corpse to the village ditch and dumped it. Thinking that was the end of it, Juju was completely unprepared for the misfortunes that would soon befall his family. Ever since the water demon was caught, the villagers had been unable to catch fish for days. Juju stayed home, repairing his nets. One day, his wife called him inside. Their son had been crying non-stop all day. She had tried soothing him all morning, but nothing worked. She suggested taking him to a doctor. Juju looked at his son and saw that he didn't seem sick. He appeared to be in pain. When they removed the boy's shirt to check, they were horrified to discover a large, festering wound had appeared on his arm, so deep that the bone was nearly exposed. The couple was terrified. The night before, their son had gone to bed without any injuries. Moreover, the wound emitted the same foul stench as the water demon. Juju immediately remembered the exact spot where he had stabbed the monster. It matched the location of his son's wound. Could it be just as the old man had warned? Was this the water demon's curse? Juju was consumed with fear for his son. Swallowing his pride, he rushed to the old man's house. After hearing about the boy's condition, the old man could only sigh. According to ancient teachings, the water demon was an ancient cursed beast, known for bringing calamity. Whoever harmed it would suffer its wrath. Juju begged the elder for help. After a long pause, the old man finally recalled an old ritual, but he wasn't sure if it would work. Following the elder's instructions, Juju went to the ditch behind the village to retrieve the creature's remains. Then, he took a knife and cut into the palm of his right hand. He dripped his blood onto the creature's skull every day for 7 days. The elder explained that after 7 days, if something sprouted from the skull, it should be ground into a paste and applied to the wound to heal it. But if nothing grew, then his son would not survive. The 7 days passed, and with trembling hands, Juju went to check. To his astonishment, a strange flower had grown from the skull. It was unlike any flower Juju had ever seen. Its leaves were a deep purple red, its petals blood red, and it emitted an indescribable metallic scent. Without hesitation, Juju brought it home, ground it into a paste, and applied it to his son's wound. Astonishingly, Within 2 days, the boy made a full recovery. From that day forward, Juju truly believed in the supernatural. He commissioned a stone coffin, carefully gathered the water demon's remains, and gave it a proper burial. To ensure peace, he even built a small shrine at the burial site. It was said that in the western mountains of Ichido County, there was a young scholar named Uno. His family was not well off. His father had passed away early, leaving his blind mother to raise him with great hardship. Eventually, she even arranged a marriage for him. This was supposed to be a good thing. Uno thought that if he went out to earn a living every day while his wife stayed home to take care of his aging mother, he could feel at ease. Every time he left the house, he reminded his wife to prepare meals for his mother on time. But he had no idea that his wife was not as gentle as she appeared. She despised Uno's family for being poor. She felt that she could not enjoy any luxuries and was now stuck serving a blind old woman all day. She was so wicked that every time she cooked, she would spit into the food. Then, she would pretend to be a dutiful daughter-in-law and serve the meals to her mother-in-law. Uno knew his mother loved meat-filled buns, so every few days he would buy some meat and ask his wife to make them for her. While chopping the meat, his wife muttered curses under her breath, still angry that Uno spent money on his old mother instead of bringing it home for her. Then, seeing a cockroach crawling on the wall, a nasty idea came to her. She caught the cockroach, mixed it into the meat filling, and made the buns. Afterward, she served them to her mother-in-law. The old woman sensed that something tasted off, but didn't dare to say anything. She simply invited her daughter-in-law to eat with her. But in truth, the wife never ate the food she prepared for her mother-in-law. However, the old woman claimed the buns were too hot and said she would eat them later. She made up an excuse and sent her daughter-in-law away. Then, she secretly hid the bun and later told her daughter-in-law that she had finished eating. When Uno returned home, she took out the bun and asked him to check if something was wrong with it. Uno took a bite and immediately noticed the distinct foul smell of a cockroach. Tearing the bun apart, he discovered a large cockroach hidden inside. However, he did not dare to tell his mother about this. He simply told her that the meat had gone bad and promised to buy fresh meat to make new buns for her. That night, Uno was furious and wanted to scold his wife, but he feared his mother would hear and be troubled. So he simply went to bed with a face full of anger. His wife, knowing that her secret had been exposed, did not dare to go to bed. She kept pacing back and forth on the floor. Uno could hear her heavy snorting breaths and snapped at her. When she did not respond, he sat up to take a look, only to find that his wife was gone. Instead, standing by the bed, was a pig. Looking closer, Uno realized that the pig's hooves were actually human hands and feet. It was then that he was horrified to realize that his wife had turned into a pig. When the county magistrate heard of this, he ordered his men to parade her through the streets as a warning against unfilial behavior. The townspeople who witnessed the scene were terrified. Eventually, Uno brought his wife back home. Every day, he only fed her husks and rice water. He never remarried and personally cared for his mother until she passed away. It is said that on Paradise Island, there was a man named Ziya who loved exploring strange and mysterious things. He had traveled to and experienced every nearby island. During a feast, Ziyar lamented to his friends that he had no new place to visit. A friend mentioned an island called Fairy Tale Island in the East Sea. It was said to have breathtaking scenery, but was extremely difficult to find. Ziyar, intrigued, asked his friend for directions to the island. His friend was uncertain but told Ziyar to head east. He said that if Ziyar saw an island shaped like a snake's head, that would be the one. Excited, Ziyar prepared wine, food, and a boat. He set sail alone toward the distant island, feeling thrilled about this solo adventure. After drifting on the sea for some time, he finally spotted the island. Fairy Tale Island was not large, but its scenery was picturesque. The moment Ziyar arrived, he felt an exhilarating excitement. Along the way, peach blossoms were in full bloom, drifting through the air, creating an enchanting scene. Ziyar found an ancient tree so massive that it would take several people to embrace its trunk. He sat beneath it. He opened a jar of wine and drank heartily, completely relaxed and savoring the moment. Admiring the beautiful scenery, he regretted not bringing someone along. Just as he was feeling a bit melancholic, a woman in a red dress emerged from the vibrant flower forest. He had expected to enjoy this paradise alone, but to his surprise, there was someone else, a woman so beautiful she seemed otherworldly. Ziyar quickly stood up, greeted her, and invited her to drink with him. As they conversed, Ziyar learned that the woman came from a nearby island and had also come here to admire the scenery. She mentioned that she had come with someone named Jiro, but since he was busy hunting wild animals, she decided to wander alone. The two of them chatted happily. As the wine took effect, Ziyar found himself mesmerized by the woman's beauty. She was indeed a stunning beauty, her eyes filled with hidden emotions. Overcome with desire, Ziyar embraced her and suggested that since Jiro had not yet arrived, they should enjoy some intimacy. The woman did not refuse. They began to undress, preparing for passion. Just as Ziyar was about to lose himself in pleasure, a fierce gust of wind suddenly howled through the forest. In the wind, a massive, black shadow appeared, accompanied by a terrifying roar that echoed through the air. The woman then calmly stated that her husband had arrived. Ziyar was stunned. He had assumed Jiro was merely her friend. But the most horrifying revelation was yet to come. Jiro was not a man. He was a giant snake. Overcome with terror, Ziyar hastily put his clothes back on and hid behind a large tree. Trembling, he thought to himself, "If I don't move, maybe I won't be noticed. Maybe I can escape." But the snake had already detected him and slithered toward the tree. The enormous snake coiled around the tree multiple times, trapping Ziyar against the trunk. Its head loomed close to his face. Ziyar was so petrified that he couldn't move. The snake suddenly lunged toward Ziyar. Without warning, the serpent opened its massive mouth and let out a deafening roar. Its long tongue shot out, stabbing into Ziyar's forehead, leaving a deep gash. Ziyar was in absolute terror. Blood trickled down his face, but instead of devouring him, the snake seemed to be observing him. His blood dripped onto the ground, forming a crimson pool. The snake flicked out its tongue and licked the blood. Ziyar was being squeezed so tightly that his bones ached, and his blood continued to flow. He felt hopeless, certain that he would die. In his desperate state, he suddenly remembered something. He had a highly toxic medicinal powder in his pouch. With that thought, a plan formed in his mind. Gathering all his remaining strength, he took out the powder and mixed it with the blood in his palm. Within moments, his blood was fully infused with poison. As expected, The snake was addicted to drinking blood. It extended its tongue and licked Ziyar's poisoned blood. The poison worked. After just a few licks, the snake stiffened and let out a painful hiss. It quickly loosened its grip on Ziyar and began writhing in agony. Its body convulsed violently, thrashing against the ground. It flailed about wildly, knocking down trees as it struggled. Holding his breath, Ziyar hid behind a large rock, not daring to move. The snake's violent thrashing uprooted trees and shook the ground. After 30 minutes, it finally stopped moving. Ziyar cautiously peered out and saw that the giant snake was dead. He hurried to find the woman in red, but she had vanished without a trace. After resting briefly, Ziyar dragged the massive snake onto his boat and set sail for the mainland. Selling such a giant snake would surely fetch a fortune. However, a week after returning home, Ziyar suddenly fell ill. Every time he closed his eyes, he dreamed of the woman in red appearing before him. At first, she was affectionate and gentle, but then she would suddenly transform into the giant snake and coil around him tightly. The nightmares continued for over a month. Although he eventually recovered, his health deteriorated. Ziyar never lived long. He passed. This terrifying story was told to me by my grandfather, and he assured me that it was real. That's because the main character in the story was my grandfather himself. It was such a horrifying experience that he could never forget for the rest of his life. It happened when he had just turned 15 years old. In the rural area where my grandfather lived, the scenery was very peaceful. After the war, everything gradually developed. The people focused on agriculture, and life became more prosperous. At that time, my grandfather's family was quite well off compared to others in the village. So when he returned home from school, he didn't have to work in the fields. Instead, he would just hang out with his best friend. His daily routine was quite exciting. He would go to the forest behind the mountain to pick fruit, catch birds, play games, and swim in the lake. The birds he caught would either be kept as pets or taken to the market to sell to bird enthusiasts. Sometimes, if he spotted a large bird's nest, he would climb up to grab it. However, just as he was about to take the nest, the father bird suddenly returned. It pecked at him so hard that he lost his balance and fell from the tree. Fortunately, the ground below was soft, and his friend managed to break his fall, so neither of them was seriously hurt. Then, they looked at each other and laughed. My grandfather recalled that back then, he had a truly amazing best friend. Almost every day, they would meet up and go on adventures around the village together. But then, one day, something terrifying happened when they went to swim in the lake behind the mountain. In the old days, only boys swam in the lake, so my grandfather and his best friend had no hesitation in stripping down completely. His friend was a bit timid and only stayed near the shore, while my grandfather was braver and liked to swim out far. In fact, his friend had learned how to swim from him. Their personalities were complete opposites. While they were swimming, my grandfather suggested they compete to see who could hold their breath underwater the longest. His friend, not very good at it, hesitated. At that moment, neither of them knew that something dangerous was lurking beneath the water. My grandfather swam out further and signaled that he would go first. Then he immediately dove underwater. Suddenly, his eyes widened in shock. What he saw beneath the water confused him. He wasn't sure what it was. It somewhat resembled a turtle and was swimming upward from below. Even more terrifying, my grandfather saw its blood-red eyes, and it was heading straight for his friend. Horrified, my grandfather surfaced and desperately shouted to warn his friend to run. But it was too late. His friend had already noticed it. A gigantic monster was swimming toward his friend. It moved slowly but exuded a terrifying presence. Overcome with fear, his friend frantically swam toward the shore. The monster chased after him, as if it could sense the struggling prey above, and was determined to catch it. But there was no time left. The creature caught up with his friend. My grandfather recalled only seeing his friend screaming and flailing helplessly in the water. Then, the monster clamped its jaws around his friend's leg and dragged him down into the depths. My grandfather was paralyzed with fear as he witnessed the horrific scene. Rumors about the lake monster spread throughout the village, but the locals dismissed them, believing instead that his friend had simply drowned and disappeared beneath the water. No one truly believed in the monster, but from that day on, no one dared to swim in the lake again. Over time, for some unknown reason, the lake began to dry up. The once vast lake had dwindled to only a few small pools, where villagers occasionally went to catch fish. Some fish and shrimp still remained, but no one could explain why the lake had shrunk so drastically. Then, something strange happened in the sky. Thunder and lightning began to rage. Even more bizarre, the lightning grew more intense, converging over the lake's central pit. Then suddenly, the water started to churn violently, as if something was stirring beneath the surface. A massive bolt of lightning struck directly into the middle of the pit, sending water splashing everywhere. The villagers who witnessed it were stunned. They had never seen anything so strange before. Some even thought it was divine punishment. First, a drought, and now, an intense thunderstorm. But when they looked again, they were even more shocked. Emerging from the dried-up lakebed was a giant turtle, so massive that it completely covered the remaining water whole. The curious villagers gathered in large numbers to watch. Even my grandfather rushed to see what was happening, and what he saw, he could never forget. It was the exact same monster he had seen beneath the water just a month ago. Now, however, it had been struck by lightning and was charred black. It was also the first time my grandfather had ever seen such a gigantic turtle. That was the creature that had captured and devoured his best friend. Now, the villagers finally believed his story and realized the horrifying truth about the monster that had lurked beneath the lake. But one question still haunted my grandfather. How did such a massive turtle end up in the lake? And why did it hunt and eat humans? This terrifying event occurred on January 13th, 1954, at the Mekong River. Mr. Shu from the village was transplanting rice seedlings in his family's flooded field. But today, he had an unusual feeling in his heart, an inexplicable unease, and the weather was drier than usual. He looked around, but saw nothing strange. Mr. Shu was a native living along the river, and was extremely familiar with the ancestral fields that had been in his family for generations, as well as the surrounding environment. Suddenly, a thought flashed through Mr. Shu's mind, and he realized something. Behind him was the turbulent river, which roared loudly every day. But today, where was the sound of water? Mr. Shu couldn't understand what was happening, so he quickly ran up to the top of the high embankment to take a look. But when he saw the scene behind the embankment, Mr. Shu was completely stunned. He truly couldn't believe what he was seeing. The river that had flowed ceaselessly for thousands of years was now completely dry. The entire river had vanished, leaving not a single drop of water. This completely shocked Mr. Shu, who had spent his entire life by the Yangtze River. Every few years, this river would flood, claiming the lives of thousands of people on both banks, yet it also sustained generations of Yangtze River inhabitants. But now, the river had suddenly disappeared. What was even more disturbing was the countless fish and shrimp struggling, flopping on the mud and sand where the river used to be. Cargo ships in the distance were also stranded, tilting awkwardly in the dry riverbed. The unbelievable sight before him made Mr. Shu recall the strange occurrences in the village the night before. That morning, villagers gathered to chat, joking about how they all experienced sleep paralysis the previous night. As they then continued talking, they realized that almost the entire village had been paralyzed by sleep at the same time last night, filling everyone with fear and anxiety. Mr. Shu looked at the dried-up river before him and thought to himself, could this be a warning from the heavens? Before Mr. Shu could fully comprehend the situation, villagers, upon hearing the news, rushed to the embankment and ran down into the riverbed. It should be noted that in the 1950s and 60s, people were very poor, and the stranded fish and shrimp in the riverbed were an incredibly tempting sight. The villagers excitedly watched the fish and shrimp jumping around in the dried riverbed and immediately rushed in to gather them. A bad feeling arose in Mr. Shu's heart, but he couldn't put it into words. Just then, Mr. Shu's son arrived, carrying a wooden bucket, eager to join the others in collecting fish and shrimp. Seeing his father, the boy excitedly said he would catch plenty of fish for the family. However, before his son could run down, Mr. Shu, filled with fear, rushed forward to pull him back. Mr. Shu had heard from the elderly that this river had dried up like this once before, 600 years ago. And that time, countless people living along the riverbanks lost their lives to the returning waters. Previously, Mr. Shu had dismissed these tales as mere legends passed down by the elderly. But now, seeing everything before his eyes, he suddenly understood. It wasn't just a story. It was a nightmare. Mr. Shu couldn't stop the excited crowd. He could only watch helplessly as the villagers happily gathered the stranded fish and shrimp from the riverbed. They even found soft-shell turtles. Everything seemed to be going perfectly for them. Although Mr. Shu's son obeyed him, seeing everyone else gathering so much made him feel uneasy. But he trusted his father. Though his father was just an ordinary farmer, he understood. He understood this river better than anyone. The more the villagers gathered, the less they wanted to leave, always hoping to catch something even bigger. Gradually, more and more people filled the riverbed. Mr. Shu and his son walked along the embankment back toward the village, and with each step, the son's belief in his father grew stronger. Because the riverbed, which had always been hidden beneath the ceaselessly flowing turbulent waters, was now fully exposed before their eyes. The bottom of the Yangtze River, unseen for thousands of years, held too many unimaginable horrors. Bones covered the ground, animal bones, and even human bones. It was terrifying. Seeing this, Mr. Shu's son was relieved he had listened to his father. Those fish had probably eaten human flesh. If they caught and ate them, he couldn't even imagine the consequences. As they walked, Mr. Shu told his son about the mysteries of the river, warning him of the things to be feared. It wasn't a coincidence that the entire village had sleep paralysis the night before. Just as Mr. Shu and his son reached the end of the embankment, a thunderous sound rumbled from afar. But those immersed in their joy and excitement did not realize that death was approaching with earth-shattering force, rushing toward them. Upstream, at the dried riverbed, a massive white wave was surging down toward the lower reaches. It was a towering wall of water, dozens of meters high, charging forward with terrifying momentum, like an enraged dragon crashing down with unimaginable force. Only now did the people in the riverbed notice it, but they were all paralyzed with fear at the sheer power and ferocity of the wave. Without giving anyone a chance to react, the violent waves crashed upon them in an instant. The people, like ants toyed with by the heavens, had no time to recover from their joy before their lives were swallowed whole. In an instant, hundreds, thousands of people were engulfed by the raging water. Their screams and cries for help echoed across the river, only to be drowned out by the overwhelming surge. In the blink of an eye, the river returned to its natural state, as if those struggling souls had never existed, leaving no trace behind. Mr. Shu and his son stood frozen on the embankment, witnessing hundreds of lives being swallowed before their very eyes, their hearts filled with indescribable terror. This drying of the river lasted for over 3 hours. Then it was suddenly filled again, flowing as if nothing had ever happened. Mr. Shu's son trembled in fear at the sight, desperately seeking an answer from his father. Why had all of this happened? At this moment, Mr. Shu felt his legs go weak and collapsed to the ground. Witnessing the familiar faces of his fellow villagers being swept away, unable to stop it. Indeed, how could an old man who had lived by the river all his life believe such a thing? Even he didn't know what was happening. A river that had surged for thousands of years could dry up in an instant, only to return ruthlessly, mercilessly, in the next moment, sweeping away hundreds of lives, leaving no trace. Moments ago, hundreds of villagers had been collecting fish in the riverbed. Now, they were gone, not a single one bringing their catch back to shore. If only they had not been so greedy. If only they had known when to stop, perhaps they would have survived. And maybe, the sleep paralysis the night before was a divine warning. It is said that on Paradise Island, there was a man named Ziya who loved exploring strange and mysterious things. He had traveled to and experienced every nearby island. During a feast, Ziya lamented to his friends that he had no new place to visit. A friend mentioned an island called Fairy Tale Island in the East Sea. It was said to have breathtaking scenery, but was extremely difficult to find. Ziya, intrigued, asked his friend for directions to the island. His friend was uncertain but told Ziya to head east. He said that if Ziya saw an island shaped like a snake's head, that would be the one. Excited, Ziya prepared wine, food, and a boat. He set sail alone toward the distant island, feeling thrilled about this solo adventure. After drifting on the sea for some time, he finally spotted the island. Fairy Tale Island was not large. but its scenery was picturesque. The moment Ziya arrived, he felt an exhilarating excitement. Along the way, peach blossoms were in full bloom, drifting through the air, creating an enchanting scene. Ziya found an ancient tree so massive that it would take several people to embrace its trunk. He sat beneath it. He opened a jar of wine and drank heartily, completely relaxed and savoring the moment. Admiring the beautiful scenery, he regretted not bringing someone along. Just as he was feeling a bit melancholic, a woman in a red dress emerged from the vibrant flower forest. He had expected to enjoy this paradise alone, but to his surprise, there was someone else, a woman so beautiful she seemed otherworldly. Ziya quickly stood up, greeted her, and invited her to drink with him. As they conversed, Ziya learned that the woman came from a nearby island and had also come here to admire the scenery. She mentioned that she had come with someone named Jiro, but since he was busy hunting wild animals, she decided to wander alone. The two of them chatted happily. As the wine took effect, Ziya found himself mesmerized by the woman's beauty. She was indeed a stunning beauty, her eyes filled with hidden emotions. Overcome with desire, Ziya embraced her and suggested that since Jiro had not yet arrived, they should enjoy some intimacy. The woman did not refuse. They began to undress, preparing for passion. Just as Ziya was about to lose himself in pleasure, a fierce gust of wind suddenly howled through the forest. In the wind, a massive, black shadow appeared, accompanied by a terrifying roar that echoed through the air. The woman then calmly stated that her husband had arrived. Ziya was stunned. He had assumed Jiro was merely her friend. But the most horrifying revelation was yet to come. Jiro was not a man. He was a giant snake. Overcome with terror, Ziya hastily put his clothes back on and hid behind a large tree. Trembling, he thought to himself, "If I don't move, maybe I won't be noticed. Maybe I can escape." But the snake had already detected him and slithered toward the tree. The enormous snake coiled around the tree multiple times, trapping Ziya against the trunk. Its head loomed close to his face. Ziya was so petrified that he couldn't move. The snake suddenly lunged toward Ziya. Without warning, the serpent opened its massive mouth and let out a deafening roar. Its long tongue shot out, stabbing into Ziya's forehead, leaving a deep gash. Ziya was in absolute terror. Blood trickled down his face, but instead of devouring him, the snake seemed to be observing him. His blood dripped onto the ground, forming a crimson pool. The snake flicked out its tongue and licked the blood. Ziya was being squeezed so tightly that his bones ached, and his blood continued to flow. He felt hopeless, certain that he would die. In his desperate state, he suddenly remembered something. He had a highly toxic medicinal powder in his pouch. With that thought, a plan formed in his mind. Gathering all his remaining strength, he took out the powder and mixed it with the blood in his palm. Within moments, his blood was fully infused with poison. As expected, the snake was addicted to drinking blood. It extended its tongue and licked Ziya's poisoned blood. The poison worked. After just a few licks, the snake stiffened and let out a painful hiss. It quickly loosened its grip on Ziya and began writhing in agony. Its body convulsed violently, thrashing against the ground. It flailed about wildly, knocking down trees as it struggled. Holding his breath, Ziya hid behind a large rock, not daring to move. The snake's violent thrashing uprooted trees and shook the ground. After 30 minutes, it finally stopped moving. Ziya cautiously peered out and saw that the giant snake was dead. He hurried to find the woman in red, but she had vanished without a trace. After resting briefly, Ziya dragged the massive snake onto his boat and set sail for the mainland. Selling such a giant snake would surely fetch a fortune. However, a week after returning home, Ziya suddenly fell ill. Every time he closed his eyes, he dreamed of the woman in red appearing before him. At first, she was affectionate and gentle, but then she would suddenly transform into the giant snake and coil around him tightly. The nightmares continued for over a month. Although he eventually recovered, his health deteriorated. Ziya never lived long. He passed. This terrifying story took place in a small town where a young man named Timo lived. He was short, unattractive, and extremely poor. Every day, he survived by doing odd jobs, taking on whatever work people hired him for. One day, a wealthy family hired him to watch over a garden under construction, ensuring that thieves wouldn't steal anything. Timo followed the housekeeper to the garden. After giving him instructions, the housekeeper left. He opened the gate and stepped inside. The garden had been abandoned for a long time. Everything around was desolate and ruined. He swept up a bit and decided to stay the night. Around midnight, as he was drifting off to sleep, he suddenly heard a strange noise coming from the garden. He thought to himself, could it be a thief sneaking in to steal something? Grabbing a stick, he gathered his courage and stepped outside. Looking around, he saw no one. The sound was coming from a bush near the wall. He carefully approached and peered toward the source of the noise. It turned out to be a stray cat fighting with a white snake. The white snake was at a disadvantage, about to be killed by the cat. Without much thought, he swung his stick forcefully at the cat. The cat yelped in pain, leaped onto the wall, and ran away. The white snake quickly slithered into the bushes and disappeared. Timo watched for a moment before heading back to his room to continue sleeping. The next morning, he woke up early and began doing chores for the homeowners. He carried water to water the plants. He cleaned up around the area, following the housekeeper's instructions. It wasn't until nightfall that he returned to the abandoned garden. As he pushed the door open, he was startled. A table was already set with wine and meat, but he was alone. Who had prepared all of this? While he was still wondering, a woman in a white dress slowly stepped out and called him husband, speaking to him with tenderness. Still confused, the woman explained that she lived in the house next door. That day, when Timo saved the white snake, he had actually saved the guardian spirit of her home. As a token of gratitude, she had prepared the meal for him. After explaining, she sincerely expressed her appreciation. She even stayed to drink with him. Through their conversation, he learned that she lived alone. After a few drinks, he became bolder. That night was probably the happiest of his life. It was the first time he had been with a woman. From that night on, the woman in white came to visit him every night. Though Timo grew thinner and weaker, he always had a blissful look on his face. Over time, one of his work friends began to find the situation strange. The friend deliberately invited Timo out for drinks to get information out of him. The friend said he had been watching Timo for a while. Every day after work, Timo would rush home. Surely there was a woman waiting for him there. As expected, Timo had a weak tolerance for alcohol. After just a few drinks, he spilled everything about the woman in white. He even boasted that she was utterly infatuated with him, coming every night to serve him. The friend was both astonished and jealous. He never imagined that someone like Timo could have a beautiful woman taking care of him. After getting Timo completely drunk, the friend grabbed a jug of wine and left the tavern, intent on carrying out his wicked plan. He wanted to seize the opportunity to find the woman in white for his own pleasure, thinking that if Timo could have her, he could too. Staggering toward the house next to the abandoned garden that Timo had described, he found only a deserted plot of land. Overcome with desire, he forced open the door and stepped inside. As soon as he entered the courtyard, he was so terrified that he dropped his wine jug. The scene before him left him frozen with fear. The abandoned garden was crawling with venomous snakes, and he was utterly terrified of them. In a panic, he hurled the wine jug at the snakes, causing them to scatter in fear. But then, acting in sheer cruelty, he quickly lit a fire and threw it toward the snakes. In an instant, the serpents writhed and slithered wildly as flames engulfed them. A massive white snake lunged from the inferno and sank its fangs deep into the wicked man's neck. In the end, both the snake and the man were consumed by the raging fire. The next morning, when Timo returned to the garden, he saw that the house next door had burned down. Though the fire had died out, thick black smoke still rose into the sky. For days afterward, Timo waited for his wife, but she never appeared again. He eventually returned to his impoverished, lonely life, just as before. This terrifying story took place in a small town in Zhengzhou, where a wealthy family by the surname Xu resided. The head of the Xu family was named Chen, and he had a peculiar obsession. He loved eating snake meat. It wasn't on the table every meal, but nearly every day. There had to be at least one dish made of snake meat. To him, it was the ultimate delicacy. He firmly believed that snake meat could enhance his virility and even prolong his lifespan. Just for snake meat alone, he had devised dozens of recipes and even hired a personal chef dedicated to preparing snake dishes for him. To ensure a constant supply of snakes, he ordered his servants to catch live ones every day. His household staff was rigorously trained, no matter the size, venomous or not. As long as they caught a snake, they had to bring it back to him. As long as a snake was captured, whether it was alive or dead, it didn't matter. His servants worked tirelessly, knowing that those who caught more snakes would receive generous rewards. Beyond food, Chen also considered using snakes for making medicinal wine and remedies, so he captured everything from hatchlings to fully grown serpents. Year after year, countless snakes were slaughtered in the Xu household. One day, Chen rode out on horseback for some business. Midway through his journey, the clear blue sky was suddenly swallowed by dark clouds. A deafening clap of thunder roared, sending his horse into a panic. The frightened horse reared up, throwing him off before bolting away. Around him, a storm began to brew, whipping sand and dirt into the air. Within moments, fierce winds howled violently. The sky darkened completely, making visibility difficult, and the servants accompanying him were scattered by the strong gusts. Chen struggled against the relentless wind, forcing himself to move forward. He had no idea how long he had been walking when he vaguely spotted a temple ahead. Thinking he could take shelter there until the storm passed, he made his way toward it. After knocking on the door, an elderly abbot appeared. Chen humbly requested a place to stay for the night to escape the storm. The abbot welcomed him kindly. Since it was already dinner time, he asked if Chen was hungry. Feeling hungry at that moment, Mr. Chen immediately said that it would be wonderful to have a bowl of snake meat to eat in such stormy weather. Chen blurted out his thought without much consideration, unaware that the monks around him had immediately widened their eyes in anger. Realizing that monks were strict vegetarians, he quickly apologized for his inappropriate words. A short while later, a young monk brought him a bowl of soup. Chen eagerly waited, his stomach growling with hunger. Lifting the lid, he was astonished to find that the soup contained snake meat. His eyes lit up in excitement. He never expected to be served snake meat in a temple. Driven by hunger, he paid no attention to the monk's strange expressions and devoured the entire bowl, meat and all. After finishing his meal, he stayed at the temple for the night. As he drifted into deep sleep, he felt something writhing and slithering across his body. Jolting awake, he opened his eyes and nearly let out a terrified scream. His bed was crawling with countless snakes, their shimmering scales reflecting the dim moonlight. In sheer panic, he leaped off the bed, intending to flee, but tripped and fell. A massive green snake blocked his path. From the rafters above, another serpent slithered down. Frozen with fear, Chen found himself unable to move. The enormous green snake coiled around, cutting off his escape route. Overwhelmed by terror, Chen collapsed onto the floor as countless smaller snakes slithered onto his body. More and more of them piled on, covering him from head to toe. They constricted around him so tightly that he could no longer breathe. He felt as if he was being swallowed whole. He had no idea how much time had passed when suddenly he heard someone calling his name. He jolted awake, flailing his arms and screaming, only to realize he was no longer in the temple. The snakes were gone. Standing before him were two farmers, staring at him in confusion. They explained that they had found him unconscious in the woods and came to help. From that day on, he never so much as thought about eating snake meat again. In fact, even the sight of anything remotely snake-like sent him into a fit of trembling fear. Ever since that incident, he developed a severe phobia of snakes. Just hearing the word made his limbs go weak, his face turn pale, and his breath become ragged. This terrifying story takes place in the northern mountains, where the locals have a tradition of hunting snakes. Whenever they have free time, villagers venture into the wild fields to catch snakes, using them for various purposes. They apply a special ointment to their bodies, causing any snake that sees them to freeze, unable to move. This allows them to capture snakes easily without difficulty. On average, each villager can catch 10 or more snakes per trip. The captured snakes are used to make snake wine, medicine or food, all of which can be sold for profit. That year, as usual, the villagers went snake hunting, but they found none. For some unknown reason, all the snakes in the village had disappeared. They continued searching and eventually reached a cave. Since snakes prefer cool places, they entered the cave and were overjoyed to find that all the snakes had gathered there. The cave was filled with countless snakes of all sizes. The villagers rejoiced, thinking they would soon make a fortune with such a large supply. Excited, the villagers eagerly spread their arms and rushed in to catch the snakes. Just as they were about to begin, a strange wind blew from deep within the cave, and a massive serpent slithered out, Terrified, the villagers tried to flee, but the giant snake coiled around them, crushing their bones before swallowing them whole. After devouring 2 villagers, the monstrous snake slithered out of the cave. Now, the roles had reversed. It was no longer humans hunting snakes, but a snake hunting humans. The giant serpent stormed into homes, attacking people. Refusing to surrender, the villagers decided to band together and kill the monstrous snake. However, swords and knives could not harm it. The snake had transformed into a spirit beast, bringing disaster upon the entire village. From then on, no one dared to go out to hunt snakes. Lacking food, the giant serpent frequently ventured into the village. Even more horrifying, it specifically targeted young children. And when food was scarce, it would hunt adults as well. With no other options, the villagers turned to the oldest snake hunter in town. The old snake hunter recalled an ancient method passed down for generations, though it hadn't been used in a long time. He instructed the villagers to find a large rooster and pluck its feathers. The villagers were confused. How could a mere rooster defeat a giant snake? They were skeptical of the old man's method. The snake hunter explained that this was a principle of yin and yang. Snakes belong to the yin, while roosters belong to the yang. Whether it would work or not, they had no choice but to try. The villagers found a 7-year-old rooster and plucked its feathers. Following the snake hunter's instructions, they waited for the giant snake to return to its cave, then burned the rooster's feathers right at the entrance. They fanned the rising smoke into the cave, carefully following each step as instructed. After a long wait, there was no movement from inside. A few villagers gathered their courage and stepped in. Upon entering, they were stunned. The giant serpent lay dead in the cave, an unexpectedly effective solution. This bizarre story happened to a man named Ma and his family. One night, while he was fast asleep, he suddenly heard a strange noise in the yard. He sat up and saw something slithering along the corridor, heading toward his mother's room. Alarmed, Mr. Ma quickly got up and ran outside to investigate. Seeing that his mother's door was still closed, he intended to go in and check if she was safe. But as soon as he opened the door, a large, dark figure shot out from inside the room, brushed past his head, and disappeared into the backyard. Mr. Ma was so frightened that he fell to the ground. Looking up, he saw that the creature seemed to be an enormous snake. Gathering his courage, he rushed into the room, only to find his mother lying there with a bite wound on her throat. She had died instantly. Overwhelmed with grief, Mr. Ma couldn't believe that his mother had been killed so cruelly by a monster. After arranging his mother's funeral, he invited a strange Taoist priest to capture the serpent demon that had taken his mother's life. The Taoist examined both the front and backyards before stopping at a water channel in the backyard. After investigating for a while, the priest deduced that the creature's lair must be nearby. It had likely been using the water channel to enter Mr. Ma's house. The Taoist invited Mr. Ma to stay up and wait with him to see the true form of the demon, as he was certain it would return. As night fell, the moon hung high in the sky. The eerie silence of the night made the atmosphere around Mr. Ma's house even more terrifying. Mr. Ma and the Taoist hid behind a wall, waiting until midnight. Tonight, he was determined to make the monster pay for his mother's death. Suddenly, a creature pushed open the stone cover of the water channel and poked its head out. Its mouth opened and closed rhythmically as it bowed toward the moon as if in worship. The Taoist immediately recognized it as an enchanted eel. Though it resembled a snake, it wasn't one. It was a creature in the process of cultivation, and such beings usually did not harm people without reason. Hearing this, Mr. Ma suddenly recalled a childhood memory that he suspected was related to this incident. When he was young, he and his friends used to catch eels in the fields. That day, he was particularly lucky. He caught 3 large, plump eels. Normally, they would only catch small eels and a few fish. But these eels seemed to be a family, and it was the first time he had ever caught such large ones. When he got home, he ate 2 of them, saving the largest one for later. However, when he went to check on it, the eel had already pushed open the lid of the jar and escaped into the backyard water channel. Mr. Ma tried to catch it, but failed, and eventually he forgot all about it. Now that he thought about it, that eel must have survived and cultivated into a spirit. The Taoist explained that Mr. Ma's family had eaten its wife and children, so now it had returned to take revenge. The Taoist also noted that this enchanted eel had the potential to cultivate the right path, but unfortunately, it had chosen the wrong one. To protect Mr. Ma's family, the Taoist came up with a plan. However, they had to be extremely careful not to alert the eel. The priest carefully instructed Mr. Ma on what to do and asked his entire family to prepare. That night, none of Mr. Ma's family went to sleep. They all hid in the firewood storage, anxiously waiting for the monster to appear. At midnight, the giant eel slithered out of the water channel and headed straight for Mr. Ma's bedroom. It was filled with murderous intent, ready to take revenge for the death of its family. The Taoist had already hidden inside the room. The moment the eel entered, he sprang up and attacked it with his sword. A fierce battle broke out. The Taoist was skilled in magic and swift in movement, making it difficult for the creature to land a blow on him. After more than 10 exchanges, the eel suffered multiple wounds. Realizing it was no match for the Taoist, it turned to flee and rushed back toward the water channel in the backyard, just as the Taoist had predicted. But as soon as it entered, the water suddenly turned red with blood. The giant eel thrashed violently and burst out of the channel. Its belly split open from head to tail, dying in agony. It turned out that while the Taoist was fighting the eel, Mr. Ma had ordered his servants to bury bamboo blades inside the water channel. When the eel tried to escape, it was sliced open by the hidden blades, leaving blood flowing everywhere. If one had not seen it with their own eyes, no one would have believed that such a gigantic eel had ever existed in this world. This terrifying story happened to a young man named Kuban. Not only was he highly educated, but he was also a very filial son. In his free time, he would always take his mother out for walks. Everyone who knew him spoke highly of him. People believed that he was not only a devoted son, but also a humble and kind-hearted person. Because of this, Kuban was well liked by everyone in town. One day, Kuban took his mother to the city god temple to make offerings. Being an atheist, he didn't believe in these things. Moreover, aside from gods, the temple was also home to demons. He never understood why there were demon statues inside the temple. However, since his mother was very devout, he always accompanied her and knelt beside her in prayer. The deity of this temple was very powerful, and because of this, the townspeople believed they were always protected by the gods. However, since Kuban had no faith, he could not receive this divine protection. As a result, he caught the attention of the demons lurking in the temple. Ever since he returned from the city god temple, strange things began happening to Kuban. He suddenly developed a case of madness. Whenever his episodes occurred, he would scream loudly, run wildly through the village, and flail his arms and legs uncontrollably. It was as if he was struggling with someone. He claimed that something was constantly clinging to him and tormenting him. People whispered among themselves, finding his behavior unsettling. Yet, there was no one around him. Those who knew Kuban pitied him, seeing him fall into such a state. Strangely, when he was not having an episode, he was completely normal. One day, he even made plans to drink wine and recite poetry with his friends. The gathering was lively, but suddenly, Kuban flew into a fit of rage and hurled his wine cup against the wall. Then, to everyone's shock, he climbed onto a chair. He appeared to be grabbing hold of an invisible rope in the air. He placed his neck inside it, hanging mid-air, but strangely, there was no actual rope. His feet were truly suspended above the ground. His friend, seeing this, rushed over and pulled him down. After calling his name repeatedly, Kuban gradually returned to normal. He then told his friend that a wicked woman had been clinging to him, forcing him to hang himself. His friend was greatly disturbed upon hearing this. His family had invited countless famous doctors to treat him, but none could diagnose his condition. They also sought out many exorcists, but none of the rituals worked. Later, when Kuban was in a clear state of mind, he told his mother about the strange things he had been experiencing. He said that a few days ago, during an afternoon nap, his bedroom door suddenly swung open. In a daze, he saw an ugly, fat woman barging into the room. Without saying a word, she lunged at him, attempting to violate him. Of course, Kuban resisted, struggling to escape. However, the grotesque woman clung to him relentlessly. Her strength was unnatural, and Kuban could not fight back. He could not even scream. Whenever she appeared, all he could do was try his best to flee, but no matter where he ran, she would always appear right behind him. To outsiders, his actions seemed like those of a madman. That night at the tavern, it was the same woman who forced him to put his head in the noose, trying to strangle him to death for refusing to submit to her. Another time, when he was drinking by the lake with some friends, the woman appeared again, attempting to drag him into the water to drown him. If not for his friends saving him in time, he would have lost his life to her. His mother, after hearing this, was both terrified and deeply worried. She immediately went to the city god temple, hoping there was still a way to save him. She knelt and pleaded earnestly, begging the city god to exorcise the female demon. However, the city god remained silent, sitting high on his throne. That night, as Kuban sat reading in his home, the female demon appeared once more. But this time, another figure emerged behind her. He was clad in iron armor and wore an ornate crown. He seized the demon without hesitation. He dragged her out into the courtyard. The demon offered no resistance. The armored deity flung her to the ground as if she were nothing but a sack of sand. Suddenly, a cloud of dust and smoke erupted. The woman immediately transformed into a monstrous demon with bulging eyes, sharp fangs, and a body covered in red fur. She looked exactly like the demon statues in the city god temple. The iron-clad deity ignored the demon's desperate pleas. He stomped on her, crushing her into dust that scattered in the wind. After vanquishing the demon, the deity turned and left. From that day on, Kuban returned to normal, no longer plagued by madness. He often accompanied his mother to the city god temple, sincerely kneeling in prayer. People say that in a town in the western mountainous region, there is a dangerous rapid with strong currents and an unfathomable depth. It is said that beneath these waters lies the Dragon King's palace. One day, two close friends, Xing and Zung, passed through this area after drinking. Taking the opportunity, Xing began telling his friend about the grand dragon palace said to exist beneath the river. Zung only laughed, treating it as a joke, and asked his friend how he could believe in such nonsense. Xing then seriously warned him to be careful with his words, or the Dragon King might drag him down to become a servant. As the two continued walking, Xing suddenly shouted and pointed at the water, having just spotted a giant fish. Beneath the crystal-clear water, a massive fish was floating silently. In his drunken excitement, Xing immediately jumped into the water, attempting to catch the giant fish. But the moment he touched the water, Xing was instantly swept away by the strong current. Zung had heard before that there was a mysterious man in the area with extraordinary swimming skills. Only he could save someone from such treacherous waters. Without hesitation, Zung rushed to find the man and begged him to rescue Xing. The mysterious man, who was drunk at the time, laughed and agreed to help, but he demanded 10 jars of wine as payment. Zung quickly agreed, saying that if it meant saving his friend, even 100 jars would be worth it. The man nodded and had Zung help carry the wine to the riverbank. Upon reaching the river, he started drinking, one jar after another. He drank 7 or 8 jars in succession, and then, staggering slightly, he slowly approached the water's edge. Suddenly, he leaped into the raging current. Zung stood on the shore, waiting anxiously, but the man did not resurface for a long time, making him increasingly worried. Nearly half an hour later, the man finally emerged from the water. Seeing that the man had come back alone, Zung was devastated, believing that his friend had been lost forever. The mysterious man sat down on the sandy shore with a sigh. He explained that he had found Xing at the bottom of the river, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't pull him up. The man then drank a few more jars of wine, saying that the alcohol would warm his body, and he was determined to dive back down once more. With that, he plunged into the water again. Not long after, he resurfaced, this time dragging a person up with him. It was Xing. Once they were back on shore, Zung frantically called Xing's name and shook him. After a while, Xing slowly regained consciousness. When asked what had happened, Xing claimed that he had seen the Dragon Palace. He recounted how, after jumping in to catch the fish, he had ended up clinging to its back as it moved through the water. Eventually, it carried him to the front of a majestic palace beneath the river. However, the palace gates were guarded by soldiers who refused to let him enter. With no other choice, Xing could only sit and watch as two merfolk played chess. After that, he lost consciousness and remembered nothing more. Zong believed that Xing's story was merely a hallucination caused by his near-death experience, but Xing remained convinced that he had truly seen the Dragon Palace. In the coastal region of Shandong, sailors always carry a packet of ash paper whenever they set out to sea. This ash paper is created by burning sheets of paper inscribed with magical symbols. At that time, enormous fish often appeared in the ocean, their size many times larger than the boats. The terrifying thing about these giant fish is that they can easily swallow an entire boat. These sea monsters have long been a source of fear for sailors. When encountering these massive fish, all one has to do is take out the packet of ash paper and sprinkle some ashes toward the creature. Instantly, the fish will retreat and swim away, while storms and giant waves will gradually subside. This is considered a life-saving treasure for all who venture out to sea. However, some people do not carry it with them. Once, a salt merchant's ship set sail. As they reached the middle of the sea, they encountered a giant fish capable of swallowing the entire ship. In their rush to depart, they had forgotten to bring the ash paper. In a moment of crisis, the salt merchant ordered the sailors to find anything they could throw into the belly of the giant fish. Wine, meat, and all the food on the ship were thrown into the creature's mouth. Desperate to survive, the merchant ordered the sailors to throw all the salt into the fish's stomach. Dozens, even hundreds of sacks of salt were tossed into the massive fish's belly. To everyone's surprise, the giant fish writhed and then turned away, swimming off into the distance. A few days later, a massive fish carcass washed ashore, stretching several dozen meters long, with its stomach torn open and its insides completely rotted. Inside its belly were countless torn sacks of salt. This real-life tale has been told countless times by seafaring fishermen,